are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. Egypt joins the South African ICC case, and the UN votes on Palestine state recognition. Joining us to discuss this, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Egypt's going to join the genocide case against Israel. Cairo has described the move as a response to the worsening intensity of attacks on civilians in Gaza. Dr. Horne, your thoughts?
Well, this is obviously a crisis for what is becoming the latest pariah state, speaking of Israel. Not only has Egypt decided to join this measure by South Africa and the International Court of Justice, but it has been joined, as I understand it, by Ireland and also Turkey as well. Keep in mind as well that lined up to recognize an emerging impending Palestinian state are Spain, Ireland once again, and Slovenia. Speaking of Ireland, it's assuming the vanguard role. Recall that just last week, Trinity College in Dublin voted to divest from its endowment corporations that are involved in war making in Israel. In other words, it accomplished in one fell swoop what students across the United States from the Atlantic and Pacific are being arrested for as we speak. I should also say that this is causing a deep and profound crisis within the U.S. ruling class between the Zionist wing and the not-so-Zionist wing. The not-so-Zionist wing would like to focus on the People's Republic of China and Russia, particularly since we know this week President Xi and President Putin are meeting by some accounts for the 41st time, which is quite extraordinary. The PRC is surging ahead in green energy, in quantum computing, in electric vehicles, and space exploration. The United States feels that it's falling behind and that it is not being assisted by its erstwhile ally in Israel. If you look at the New York Times website today, you'll see an opinion piece by their well-known columnist, David Brooks, who comments on the recent New York Times analysis from yesterday, which shows that Mr. Trump is leading in a number of swing states in terms of the November 2024 election. According to David Brooks, the U.S. electorate wants change, but they're demanding, according to Mr. Brooks, reactionary change. What Mr. Brooks needs to realize is that part of the problem is that Mr. Biden has adopted a good deal of Mr. Trump's platform with regard to dealing with China, including tariffs, protectionism. For example, recent tariffs of 100% on certain Chinese exports to the United States of America. And actually, the electorate may be determining and deciding that rather than the inauthentic version of Trumpism, they would like the real thing. And that's something that the Democrats need to ponder. We also know that in terms of the pro-Zionist wing of the U.S. ruling class, they and their minions are treating campus encampments as if they are backing settlers on the West Bank. That is to say, mounted cops in Austin, Texas, routing campers, brutalizing of the encampments at UCLA, which has led to not only a university-wide investigation, but apparently forces in Sacramento are trying to accomplish the same thing. We already know that the spouse of comic Jerry Seinfeld has confessed to funding these thugs at UCLA, and obviously she needs to be brought to account, just like in a certain measure, Mr. Seinfeld himself was brought to account when students walked out on his commencement speech at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. You also see the roughhousing of professors at Dartmouth and Emory. What we're seeing right now is what some of us have predicted for a while, that it was unsustainable and untenable for the United States to back thug-like tactics abroad without that boomerang. We began to see as much in the aftermath of the failed 2003 invasion and overthrow of Saddam Hussein, failed in the sense that it did not accomplish its overall purposes. But what we saw in that aftermath was a lot of U.S. Pentagon materiel being shipped to local police departments, including armed personnel carriers. And of course, you begin to see that being deployed in Ferguson, Missouri, in the wake of anti-police brutality protests. And now these tactics have migrated from Ferguson to campuses. And so this is leading to a crisis, leading to reputational damage for U.S. imperialism. You saw the recent statement, I'm sure, by President Erdogan of Turkey, who upbraids the United States for their hypocrisy. Of course, this is bringing South Africa under the gun. They have elections in a few weeks, and the United States is quite upset with the government in Pretoria. They're upset because the government of Pretoria is a stalwart member of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, in their longstanding alliance with the South African Communist Party. They're upset as well by the fact that right now, as we speak, Wayne Montashe, who is a leading South African communist and the leading member of the Department of Mining in Pretoria, is blocking a merger between BHP of Australia and Anglo American of South Africa, a major force when it comes to mining. This merger is attempting to create a bloc that can compete with China in the all-important metals department. But alas, Pretoria is blocking this. And so what we need to now watch for is not only interference by the United States in the internal affairs of South Africa, but also putting pressure on its neighbors. And in that regard, pay attention to what's happening in Mozambique, the neighbor to the east and the north of South Africa, where there is a religious insurgency that's brewing, which is quite extraordinary for that part of Africa. We call as well that the United States is upset with South Africa backing South Africa's northern neighbor, Namibia, which is pressing a reparations claim against U.S. ally, the Federal Republic of Germany. The United States is upset with South Africa because it has not joined in the attempt to strangle the government in neighboring Zimbabwe. And now, of course, as we began this conversation, you have the mushrooming of this International Court of Justice measure by South Africa, seeking to bring Israel to account. And in that regard, note that in the United Nations, on the recent vote on Palestine, which was a step forward to getting full diplomatic recognition for a Palestinian state, that you had abstentions by key U.S. allies, including the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, Ukraine, even the United Kingdom, believe it or not. So all of this bespeaks a growing and deepening crisis of U.S. imperialism, with Israel being at the nub, and that in turn is going to deepen an ongoing crisis between the Zionist wing of the U.S. ruling class and the not-so-Zionist wing, all to the detriment of U.S. imperialism.
One more quick question before we go. Your thoughts on, I've been discussing the fact that that young people, and that the economic link, in that these are young people who, if you look at their future, if you look at their present economically, they're driving Uber, they're getting their degree and great things, and they can't find a job, and they're working in Pizza Hut, but they owe $1,000 a month, for school tuition. Do you think there's a connection between the economic pain and misery of these young people and their pushback against U.S. imperialism?
Well, clearly. I mean, ultimately and objectively, the students are complaining about a warlike economy, an economy that privileges spending our tax dollars on the Pentagon rather than on human needs. That, in turn, circumscribes the ability of oftentimes humane and humanitarian students seeking an attempt to make a mark in the education sector and the healthcare sector. But those two sectors are on the chopping block because of the Pentagon spending absorbing all the oxygen in the room. And so certainly there's a connection objectively between what the students are protesting and what the government is doing.
Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and a researcher.